first, I just want to say good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's joined us here today. My name is Erica Bond. I'm the Vice President of Justice Initiatives here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I run our Future of Public Safety initiative, which helps communities across the country reshape safety policy, programs, and budgets to support healthy, safe, and racially just communities. If you'd like to learn more about our Future of Public Safety initiative, which John Jay's President Carol Mason launched in 2020, you can check out a link that Rebecca will drop in the chat. So thank you, Rebecca. Today, I'm here really to welcome you to the 5th webinar of the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge workshop series, which we host in partnership with our good friends over at Cities United and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, as well as with the support of the Obama Foundation's My Brother's Keeper Alliance. I've got a few housekeeping items before we start. One is I want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available later on, so you can share it with other folks who aren't able to attend today. I also want to note that the views that are expressed here are those of the presenters individually, not the Obama Foundation, John Jay College, or our partner organizations. The Q&A feature is enabled, and we invite you to enter any questions that you have into that box at any point throughout the conversation. And we'll have a little time at the end to respond to as many questions as we can. For those of you that are not familiar with the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge, this pledge invites local elected officials to commit to investing in at least one of 3 key public safety strategies. The first is around empowering communities to address violence and promote safety, for example, through grant making to local nonprofits that intervene to break cycles of violence. And we'll talk a little bit about that strategy today. The second is a strategy that the pledge invites local officials to invest in is the creation of off-ramps from the criminal legal system. So this could include investing in programs that divert people from arrest and incarceration into mental health services, substance misuse treatment, or supportive housing. And then finally, the pledge calls on local officials to invest in programs that prevent crime by promoting healthy communities. And that could include things like investments in programs that evidence shows improve safety, like youth employment, addressing vacant lots, as well as programs that promote racial reconciliation between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And I think we will touch on actually all 3 of these different strategies at different points during the conversation today. If you want to learn more about the pledge and the communities that have made these commitments, you can take a look at our website. And again, the link will be posted in the chat. So now let's turn to today's topic. I really do want to thank everyone for joining us on this day after an election that is not just consequential for the nation as a whole, but has really significant implications for public safety funding and policy in communities around the country. As you all know, issues of crime and safety have been front and center during this last election cycle. And unfortunately, as is often the case with issues related to crime and violence, we've seen a lot of fear-mongering and a lot of misinformation. A lot of attention has been paid to highlighting issues of violence and crime, both real and imagined, but less attention has been paid to addressing proven and promising interventions that communities are implementing today and moving forward to advance safety and justice. So today's webinar highlights a number of ways that government is investing directly in people and in their communities to prevent and address crime. The programs that you're going to hear about today invest in community-based nonprofits and leaders to address the needs of communities and people at highest risk of violence and crime. And by investing in these kinds of programs, localities have the potential to reduce their reliance on the kinds of overly punitive enforcement and criminal justice responses that evidence has shown can actually undermine public safety and reduce trust in the criminal system, and I think government as a whole. It's important to note that many of the programs that we will talk about today, such as community violence intervention and reentry programs, take time. They take time to build, and they require long-term support in order to be successful. We cannot expect that a small number of nonprofit organizations that don't have the kind of meaningful support that criminal justice agencies have received for decades can have a sustained impact on public safety. And that's why we will talk today about how communities are maintaining and scaling community-based public safety programs. Finally, we'll talk also, we've got Sheyla here from the Research and Evaluation Center. We'll talk about the role of research and the role that it should and can play in assessing outcomes for community-based public safety programs. It's really important, not just for measuring the impact, but it can also help local leaders justify expanding their investments in what we know works to keep communities safe. So we've got a fantastic panel of speakers here with us today to share their experience and their expertise. And I will introduce each of them briefly, but they are far more impressive than we have time to talk about today. So we'll also put their bios in the chat if you want to learn more about each of the speakers. So first, I'd really like to give a warm welcome to Mayor Van Johnson of Savannah, Georgia. It's wonderful to have you here. I know you've got a lot going on and are quite busy taking care of Savannah, so really appreciate you joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
I will share about the mayor that he has worked on issues of crime and safety from a number of different vantage points, including as a police officer, as the director and board member of a number of youth organizations and nonprofits, as a Savannah alderman for 4 terms, and now as mayor. So we really appreciate you bringing all of that experience to bear and giving guidance to other communities as part of today's conversation. Thank you, Mayor, for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce Katy Crosby. She is the Chief of Community Engagement and Institutional Accountability at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And we're going to share more about her, and hopefully, Katy, you'll share more about yourself as we speak today. We're also joined by Patrice Funderburg, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Community Transitions. Thank you, Patrice, for joining us. And then finally, we're pleased to have Sheyla Delgado, who is the Deputy Director of Analytics and Research here at John Jay's own Research and Evaluation Center. So thank you, Sheyla, for being here to talk to us about the work that the REC does. So I am just going to dive right in, and I wanted to start by talking a little bit about your organizations or your communities and how you go about the work of building relationships between government and community-based organizations in ways that improve public safety, because so much of this work really is dependent on building those strong relationships and that trust, and it doesn't always come naturally. So I'm going to start with Mayor Johnson and ask you this. Your administration has launched a number of new initiatives and at least one new government office that is focused on investing in youth and communities in order to improve public safety. And given your background in law enforcement, some folks may find this surprising. Can you please share your thoughts on why it is so important to address public safety in this way by making investments in the community rather than focusing solely on the criminal legal system?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity, and I appreciate being here with this great panel. As a point of personal privilege, I'm from Brooklyn. I applied for John Jay College, and I did not get accepted. And I have that in my heart right now. So I'm feeling some kind of way that now y'all want to ask me to be on a panel after all these years. I waited years to say that, but that being said, I know.
We're embarrassed now, shaking our heads.
It's been a long night. But for us, I think we have to recognize that public safety is a public responsibility. And heretofore, we have always thought about public safety and police in the same sentence, and it's really not. When I used to get shipped down to Savannah on summers, the fact was we rarely saw police on our streets. It was mamas and grandmamas and aunties, and literally, you could be cutting up 3 blocks away. But the community had a village concept in such a way that, first of all, they were going to check you themselves. And then by the time you got to your home, because everybody just felt the responsibility of dealing with everyone. And so for us, we recognize that police are not supposed to be it. And so when you look at the policing of some neighborhoods, what's called disproportionate minority impact, because of the interactions, you understand why there's such a distrust of law enforcement. We recognize that the best way to address issues in communities are using community leaders, trusted messengers, credible messengers, people who have a stake in this. And so for us, this has worked really, really well to be able to prevent crime and to prevent the escalation of crime.
Thank you for that. And I want to come back and talk a little bit more about some of the specific things that you've done in order to really institutionalize this work in government. But I'll return to you a little bit later. I wanted to also turn to some of our other panelists. Katy, in your role at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, as well as you, I know, have had prior roles in government. You were the town manager for Apex, North Carolina. You were the chief of staff to the mayor in Toledo. You've done a lot of work to help broker the kinds of relationships between local government and community-based organizations that are required in order to do this important public safety work in the community. Can you tell us a little bit about those experiences and what you've learned about how to make those relationships successful?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I would say both in my current position and then also in my previous positions with local government, it's been about listening. In my current position, we do a number of listening sessions. We synthesize that information into themes, and then we report back out what we've heard, and then use that information to come up with potential solutions and work with community on implementing those solutions. And then also continuing to create opportunities for feedback loops. And we did that also at the local level when it came to addressing community police relations, gun violence reduction. It's all about listening to community, reminding them and making sure that they understand that you've heard them and what they're trying to tell you, working with them on solutions based on what you heard from them. And then that feedback loop of what you can do and what you have done to address what you've heard, and then the progress that you're making. And then I think the last thing is really acknowledging when you miss the mark. So not trying to cover that up, but acknowledging that and allowing for the community to provide constructive feedback on how to make improvements. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned is listening, repeating back, using the information that you've heard to identify potential solutions, and then reporting back how you're accomplishing those things and being very open and honest about when you miss the mark.
Thank you for that perspective. And again, we'll circle back because I want to hear a little bit more and have our viewers appreciate some of the specific programs that you've worked on where these strategies have been effective for you. But I'm going to turn it to Patrice now. You lead the Center for Community Transitions, and that was founded in 1974, as I understand it, to assist individuals and families throughout the Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina community who've been impacted by incarceration, while also serving as a thought leader on reimagining justice. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and how you see it addressing issues of community safety in partnership with government?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, just thank you for inviting me and CCT to be a part of the conversation today. We are, in fact, celebrating 50 years of strengthening second chances in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg region. And our agency began in the 70s through partnerships at the state level. It was the state that actually initially funded our agency. Through those partnerships throughout the years, and specifically around reinvesting and even investing for the first time in community on the reentry end of the spectrum, really has been about what are the things that we are learning, to Katy's point, from the folks that have the lived experience of incarceration or involvement with the criminal legal system. And what is critically important that I think CCT has done exceptionally well is how do you operationalize that? How do you operationalize the relationship with government agencies that provide housing assistance? How do you operationalize what it means to really provide supportive employment that isn't transactional, but actually leads to careers that affect economic mobility trajectories for generations to come? The agency has really been focused on that long before the narrative and sort of mainstream really got engaged in criminal justice reform. And we're proud of that. And we're proud to have served as a foundation for community initiatives such as housing reinvestment, our local reentry councils here in Mecklenburg County, and also, and more recently, the establishment of specific committees, including a criminal justice engagement committee that centers lived experience while also working across the line with a diverse group of individuals that can bring information and resources and data to provide that assistance for individuals that are navigating the collateral consequences of criminal legal system involvement, which includes incarceration. And for us at the Center for Community Transitions, that also includes individuals that have experienced the adverse impact of the deportation process. So for 50 years, we've been sort of passively doing this work, and more recently and more concretely, and when Governor Cooper here in North Carolina, after we had some racial unrest after the result of a police-involved shooting in 2016, implemented a statewide reentry action plan. So at the state level, there was a state reentry action collaborative that really centered leadership from individuals that have the lived experience of incarceration to really help frame the infrastructure of what that statewide initiative was going to be. That then led to Mecklenburg County and our county manager in 2018 implementing a racial equity action plan that had very specific strategies around public safety as well as reentry. In addition to economic mobility efforts that have been going on in the Mecklenburg County and Charlotte region since 2016, there have been a number of different ways, whether it's the mayor's racial equity action plan or small business development or housing first programs that have directly impacted and centered the lived experiences of people that have justice involvement. So it has been a collective effort, somewhat in a passive way, for 5 decades. And I would say from 2016 to present day, including Reentry 2030 initiatives around whole of government approach, we've been right at the center of what it means to draw from state and local government and the public-private partnership centering lived experience on how to operationalize a very complex way to engage in this work.
Thank you for that, Patrice. And what it sounds like to me is that you've built decades of trust with the folks that you serve and the agencies that you work with that have gotten you to a place where you can now really engage in this more complex, right, and challenging work to think holistically about public safety as opposed to just service delivery. So I appreciate you sharing that story. Because again, going back to the relationships, it takes a long time to build those, but once you do, there's a lot that you can do in partnership with government and as a way to kind of bridge the gaps between government and the communities that need to be and deserve to be served. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm going to look over here to Sheyla and ask her to share with us a little bit about the Research and Evaluation Center. And the role that you all are playing in assessing the kinds of community-based programs that we're talking about, like CCT and like the programs that are being supported in Savannah. How is the REC going about that work, and how are you serving as a partner to both the nonprofits and the government in trying to really understand what the impacts of this work can be? That was a long question, so.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It is very nice to meet all of the panelists, and thank you everyone who's here today. The Research and Evaluation Center at John Jay is a small center that next year will also turn 50, and we plan on having a celebration. We are dedicated on conducting research that strengthens community safety and improves justice outcomes. The center works on evaluating and improving public safety programs, particularly those aimed at violence prevention and intervention. Most of the projects we have worked over the past 13 years as I've been there often assess community-based approaches like the public health approach to violence prevention, which is most popularly known as Cure Violence. This is our most notable project, one that has gotten a lot of interaction from policymakers and organizers, people working in the front lines of the community. Back in 2017, we released one of our most impactful reports on 2 programs in New York City, one located in the South Bronx and another one in East New York, Brooklyn. Both of those programs demonstrated that over the term that they had been operating had been actually impactful, not only in shooting or administrative data tracks that the New York City Police Department does. So the presence of those programs was able to reduce shootings in those 2 neighborhoods in comparison to similar programs that did not have similar neighborhoods that did not have the programs. And we also conducted surveys with over 5,000 young males all over New York City, and we compared their attitudes about violence. That also turned out to be a notable finding that young men between the ages of 18 to 35 were willing, after the program had been operating for at least 3 years, that their attitudes about violence had changed over that time period. That is one example of a program that we have worked closely with, and we continue to try and understand the evidence behind it, because there's still a lot to do. We've also worked closely with the city of New York, with the mayor's office, to understand a lot of the programs that they have been implementing, like the mayor's action plan, and other interventions aimed at preventing violence. We also worked with private foundations to understand the same type of programs, as well as the state of New York.
Thank you so much for sharing, and also for that really important work. I can attest to the fact that it's research like the work that you've done on the programs in New York City that really has enabled New York City to build upon the crisis management network, which is the community violence intervention programs that operate in the city. And having that evidence, as someone I can say from personal experience who was in the mayor's office, having that research and that data was extraordinarily helpful and provided a justification to really expand the investments in that work. And I think that the investments in that work in New York City have really translated into improved safety. So action research is really important here, and it can be transformational in terms of fostering further investment. So thank you for telling us about that, Sheyla. I want to talk a little bit more about the programs themselves and the work that's being done in the community, now that we know a little bit more about each of you and the work that you do, and want to hear a little more about how the partnerships are working in practice across the public safety continuum, from crime prevention to intervention to reentry. So Mayor Johnson, community violence intervention. This is work that you are committed to in Savannah, and we know requires a real commitment, not just from the nonprofits on the ground and the credible messengers, but from local government to really make the investments that are necessary to really significantly impact violence. And one of the, I know, unique ways that Savannah is making this commitment is through a grant program run by the Office of Neighborhood Safety, and would love to hear from you about how the Office of Neighborhood Safety came to be, the kind of grant making work it's doing, and other kinds of programming that it's helping to support.
Okay, well, thank you again. I think it's been said before, you have to move at the speed of trust. And so for us, some of the issue that people have with distrust of government is that something lasts for an administration and then it goes away. For us, it has to be consistent. It has to be sustained over time, because people, they've had their experiences with government, good, oftentimes bad. Something comes along really good and then it goes away. We recognize that oftentimes when young people, particularly young people, but people in general, it's issues of choice, issues of opportunity, issues of lack of alternatives. And so for us, because we believe in redemption, and we believe in the redemptive spirit, and that we believe in prevention. We created the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. It's called ONES, but it's kind of like NSE, but it's ONES rather than spelling like ones, it's spelled what ONSE. And this is just really an opportunity for us to do a couple of things: to be able to work across sectors, to better support youth and households, and we want to keep young people alive. We want to keep them out of jail, and we want to keep them at home. And then those are really the three goals. Becomes very, very simple. And working with individuals in the community. We have great young people and older people that in our community that some have lived that life. Some understand clearly. Some come home from jails and prisons, and they don't want young people to go through the same thing. When they know better, they do better. And so for years, we've had them come. How can we help? I want to help. But we realize that engagement is not cheap. Oftentimes, particularly when you're dealing with young people, it's been strange, but the first thing they want is something to eat. And so, working in a grant program in which, first of all, you're trusting individuals that might have been justice involved, or nonprofits that are locally, but they're on the ground doing the work. People already have, they trust them. So for us, when we say moving at the speed of trust, the fact is we're using their credibility on the streets. We're helping them to be able to do the work that they're able to do. And so for us, that has worked out really, really well. The problem is just we have so many nonprofits and folks jumping up. So it's really kind of a vetting process to determine really who is the most credible in a limited pot of funds. And how do we leverage that money in the best way from people who have already done the work, who have been engaged in the work already in the communities, those who have a track record as well, particularly in areas of mentoring, also areas of family engagement. We have seen here in Savannah where we've had an incident to occur, and if you have the right people, you don't have retaliation. People who are able to bring that temperature down quickly, be able to engage, can go talk to the mama. I know this person's mom. I know their grandmom. I know their family. They know that young person. They have that credibility on the streets. They can say, hey, or hey, we need to get them out of the city for a while until things cool down. And so we've seen a pretty significant reduction in violent crime. And I think it's partly because of the ability of these individuals, these nonprofits, to be able to engage quickly on the ground. They hear stuff before we do, and it's not considered law enforcement, because it's still this aversion that if I'm talking to you, law enforcement, then there might be some penalty for me talking and telling you what I know, telling you what I'm believing, what I'm feeling. We don't really care about that. We want to keep these young people safe. We want to keep them out of jail, and we want to keep them at home.
Thank you for that. I'm curious, because you're talking about the law enforcement trust or lack thereof at times with the community, how law enforcement in Savannah has responded, and how this office in any way, interacts with law enforcement or educates about, another entity or group that's operating right in the same communities, in the same spaces as law enforcement is operating. Is that something that your Office of Neighborhood Safety engages in? How do you sort of negotiate that there's now more resources and more government support going to nonprofits in the same communities where typically law enforcement has been the primary response?
Sure, and I think you have to really retrain and change the mindset of your law enforcement. There's no law enforcement agency in the country that ever say, "I don't need more money." They always say, "Hey, we need more money. We could do it themselves," or that they don't feel that they have the credibility in those maybe they don't, because it's law enforcement. And so, for us, we've been able to really create that relationship. Our one's office. They're not law enforcement. They're not obligated to report to law enforcement. They have very clear and distinct roles at a crime scene, for example. You might see police working the scene. You might see one's folks somewhere in the background somewhere, or they might come after the police have left. Oftentimes they're in neighborhoods before things are happening. Social media has provided a wonderful opportunity for us oftentimes to see things happening before they happen. And so when we see these things happen, we have those messengers, those nonprofits out in these neighborhoods, in these communities, talking to people, trying to take down the temperature. And again, so far, lines have gotten very close, not blurred. And for us, we're very fortunate that is not, because we've seen in some cities where sometimes they become very, very blurred, and you lose the credibility because a person might feel, well, I'm talking to you, I'm really talking to the police. And it's not. They have two different reporting structures. There are firewalls that are inherent within our system to make sure they stay apart and separate. They have two different, very clear roles and two different funding streams.
So yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that you were very intentional in the way you designed the office to really make it clear that there were these different functions and that there's like an understanding, it sounds like, on the part of both law enforcement and your office around what it is they're expected to do. So
Right.
that
It's not community policing, so to speak.
right.
It's not the complete, because they would say, well, we could do that in the community policing. It's not the same thing.
Got it. And then there's a training component and
Absolutely.
education component. Yeah,
Absolutely.
like on the law enforcement side as well. Thank you. That's really helpful because I think that's something that a lot of communities are struggling with as they set up these offices. It's important to be really mindful and intentional about that because, maybe at the level of government, these things are separate, but once you get to the level of a community level, folks are going to interact. And I think it's important they understand kind of what their roles are.
And you move at the speed of trust, as I said before. The moment you lose trust, you really lost your program.
Mhm.
And so each day, each interaction is kind of a deposit in our credibility bank. And so each successful interaction helps create, because the streets know and the streets talk. And so if you're the real deal, then folks will know you're the real deal. If you're not about it, then that gets out there too. And you don't have you might have a program, but it's not going to be successful.
Thank you for sharing that guidance and advice there. I'm going to turn to Sheyla because I know that the Research and Evaluation Center is currently assessing the public safety benefits of 4 different key anti-violence initiatives across New York State. So you told us about some of the community violence intervention research you've done in New York City, but you're now looking at programs that are statewide. Can you tell us a little bit about those and why it's so important that you're doing this kind of rigorous assessment work?
Yes, absolutely. So I appreciate that you're using the word assess because we are not currently evaluating these programs as in a more conventional rigorous evaluation would call. This is just an assessment just to see where they stand, doing some analysis of the data that is available at the moment. So a lot of information not available. Each of these programs work collaboratively to improve public safety and support community resilience across, I believe, 21 counties in New York State, none of them being in New York City. The main program is called GIVE, and it stands for Gun-Involved Violence Elimination. It's a program that funds local law enforcement and community initiatives to reduce violence through data-driven strategies and partnerships, and that is where the bulk of the investment lies in this GIVE program. Then you have RICE, which focuses on, it stands for Reintegration Initiative for Safety and Empowerment, and it aims to support individuals re-entering communities post-incarceration by providing resources and services that reduce recidivism and promote safety. Then you have SNUG, which is very similar to what I described earlier as Cure Violence. It doesn't stand for anything, it's guns spelled backwards. They have some programs that operate in the city, but a majority of them operate outside of New York City in the 21 counties that are not part of New York City. And they are a violence reduction approach model after the Cure Violence model. They focus on outreach, mentorship, and conflict mediation in communities affected by gun violence. We are tracking shooting information or victimizations and incidents across these 21 counties. And hopefully we have enough information for other counties that are similar. The issue there is that they intentionally target counties that are high in gun violence or have a high prevalence of gun violence, and therefore identifying a comparison group within the available counties. It's a very challenging effort because the rest of the counties are not experiencing gun violence at the same rate as the treated counties. And we are certainly thinking of ways of perhaps including other counties, not in New York State, that look similar to those. That's likely not going to happen in this round because, as we know, when we talk about either state, local governments, or government in general, they want answers like yesterday. And it is very challenging to do a forward evaluation when we don't allow enough time to pass for these programs to operate to actually see their impact. That is it for those state level programs.
Thank you for sharing. I think one of the things that you're highlighting here is the challenge to researchers when you actually do scale, right? The fact that New York State has been able to scale this program to so many of the communities that need it means that you have trouble finding comparison groups, and that can be a challenge. But I presume some of that is because the early research was so promising, you know, with these programs. That the state felt it was important to really try to expand the work across the state. So we'll look forward to your findings from that and hope we can share that with the folks that are with us here today. So thank you for that, Sheyla. I wanted to turn to Patrice because we know that, as you've been talking about, investing in communities requires investing in people. And at CCT, your mission is to strengthen communities by helping people with criminal records or justice involvement in some way and their families find a healthier and more productive path. So when you're thinking about how you serve individuals, so this is, you know, separate from the work you're doing to create systems and policies and programs with government, you're thinking about service provision. What are the key challenges that you're seeing that people are facing who are returning home or have some contact with the system? And what kinds of programs and investments are you encouraging your government partners to make to interrupt these cycles of violence and potentially recidivism?
Yeah, thank you for that. So at the Center for Community Transitions, we follow the Aspen Institute actually has a wonderful methodology and theory of change around the 2-gen model. And the 2-gen model looks at both the impacted individual and specifically children and the caregivers to provide simultaneous support that helps bolster family reunification. So one of our programs is called Families Doing Time, where we work with the local school system as well as partners across the county to identify and work very specifically with what we estimate is about 5,000 children in our school system of about 147,000 students that have justice involvement in the home. If we target using sort of a targeted universalist approach, if we target the students who are most adversely impacted by incarceration and/or deportation, what does that family structure look like? And again, to Van's point, moving at the speed of trust and understanding that these initiatives are not transactional, we work with the families and the students over time to begin to change that generational trajectory. That's just one program. The program, which really is our flagship program and how the agency began in '74 with a very unique and explicit interest in working with men who were returning from state incarceration on housing and employment, really evolved to our LifeWorks supportive employment program. And that program is really grounded on a theory of change and methodology called perceptual control theory. Perceptual control theory, in simple terms, essentially means, what is my relationship with the perception of my felony status? Now, it's not unique to justice involvement, but the way that we've developed our curriculum around supportive employment readiness is really rooted in the individual's self-determination, their motivation, but ultimately, how am I as an individual showing up in the world, and what is my relationship with that perception? How do we change that? Ultimately, that's going to impact the criminogenic factors that impact recidivism. Recidivism being a point in time metric that really measures rearrest. But if I change my relationship with the perception of my criminal conviction status, whether it was incarceration involved or I have a criminal conviction history, how am I going to show up in the interview and selection process? How am I going to show up when I get hired? Am I going to have fear, which may lead to other behaviors that impact my ability for promotability or for mobility within an employment situation? So I like to tell folks that we've remixed workforce development to focus inward and really focus on that self-perception. Because when we teach a person how to reframe their own narrative based on their own experience, not only does that amplify, I see you, but it provides tools and strategies for that person to navigate some of the systemic inequities that we know are going to take a longer time to improve. That permeates and pollinates into our employer relationships for companies that have chosen fair chance hiring beyond ban the box to fully implement from cradle to grave, full employee life cycle, higher engagement. We know the research shows that about 13% higher retention outcomes for individuals with justice involvement, not to mention higher productivity. So the work that we do within our supportive employment program called LifeWorks really takes workforce development from personal branding, personal advocacy, how to complete the application, all of the traditional transactions around workforce development, and center that person's unique individual experience so that they have the tools that they need that are meaningful to them to navigate the selection process. And third and finally, we operate a pre-release work release program for currently incarcerated women who are serving the final 3 years or less of their state prison sentence. It's a community model where the ladies will transfer from a state prison facility to our Center for Women, where they receive all of the holistic and comprehensive wraparound supports that really give them an opportunity to sort of practice reentry before officially being released from custody. It is the only nonprofit agency in the state of North Carolina, 100 counties, that operates in this way. And we have occupancy for 30 women, and the average incarceration rate for women in the state of North Carolina is about 2,600 women at any given time. So it is a very unique model, a pre-release model that walks through everything that I just described, from family reunification and stabilization to supportive employment and job retention through our other programs. And I'm also proud to say that during the pandemic, we formally launched with resources from American Recovery, the ARPA, behavioral health, to formalize behavioral health services, including substance use recovery, as well as individual counseling for the residents that are living at our Center for Women. So our entire agency looks at a holistic approach that really centers that individual experience, and we found the evidence-based research that allows us to do that in an operational way.
Thank you, Patrice. This is an incredible scope of work that you're engaged in. And what it really does drive home for me, though, is that more than just being able to identify the services that folks need, it's a question of how you're delivering those services in the right settings with the right approaches to really help empower folks to transform their lives. And you need the right organization. And this gets to what the mayor was saying earlier about identifying the right organizations to help support and fund who are able to deliver services in a way that sometimes government cannot do directly, right? And being that trusted intermediary is so important. And that sounds like what you've really built at CCT. We are running short on time and there's so much more for us to talk about. So I'm going to ask Katy a quick question, and then I want to ask everybody a question about how you're funding and supporting this work, because you raised this issue of ARPA dollars, and I'm curious how folks are thinking about funding and sustaining the work that we're talking about here today. But first, let me ask Katy, because you worked in the city of Dayton, Ohio, and you oversaw the community initiative to reduce gun violence when you were the chief of staff to the mayor there. When you were the chief of the staff to the mayor in Toledo, you did a similar program. Can you tell us a little bit about the programs and the challenges you faced in implementing them, and also how you thought about measuring success in a few minutes if possible?
Sure, and I'll also tie in the funding piece in that, and that way you can go on to the other. So in Dayton, I'll talk about two different approaches. So when I was in Dayton, it was this three-pronged approach, which was law enforcement, community, and social services. So it was about law enforcement being able to identify those high-risk individuals so that we could narrowly tailor our solutions to address interventions to support those individuals, whether it was through case management, employment opportunities, mental health services, and then also what were the supports needed for the extended family as well. And so we had different committees that worked together to help address those different things. And then also really understanding where were those hot spots or those communities that we needed to focus on, and figuring out how the violence was happening in those communities. So were there individuals who were living in those communities that were actually committing the violence, or were there individuals coming into the community and leaving back out? And then how do you support folks that are experiencing people coming into community and leaving back out in a way that they're not being targeted by law enforcement, because the assumption is made that the crime is happening there. So working with our different committees, the social service committee was really about how do you work with employers that are willing to hire folks that may have felony convictions? How do you make sure that you support those individuals in staying with the jobs? Because oftentimes they may have a lifestyle that makes it difficult for them to stay connected to employment. Making sure that employers understand that they may need multiple interventions before they become that successful employee. And so how do you teach them the social or the soft skills that are needed to stay employed? And then, there may be needing support for their partner with, anything from diapers to milk and things like that. So what are all of those supportive services that we could put in place to help folks? We also had a data committee that really began to look at where we needed to focus our attention. So that kind of goes back to the support from law enforcement to identify the individuals, but also to identify the communities where the crime was happening, and then monitoring how those interventions were, whether or not those interventions were successful, and where are the shifts that we needed to make. We also knew that we had an uptick in young folks who were involved in violent acts, and oftentimes those disputes happened on social media. And so we have violence interrupters who had relationships with students in the schools. And so because they were coaches or they had relationships to young people, oftentimes when those conflicts arose, they were able to go and intervene before they escalated, or if there was an unfortunate incident where crime escalated, oftentimes different ones may have had relationships with different groups that were involved, and were able to talk to them, bring them together, or resolve the conflict without additional retaliation. So there were a couple different ways that we worked with those three different kind of that three-pronged approach of law enforcement, community, and social services to help implement the initiative to reduce gun violence in Dayton. The one thing that I will say that I noticed about these programs is that, crime is really also about investments that we're making in community and driven by what is happening with the economy. And so oftentimes when we saw shifts in the economy, you may see this uptick in crime. And because you see this uptick going in the wrong direction, we want to switch interventions or switch gears and do something different. But I think these programs are really about the long game and making continual investments, even though there may be shifts periodically based on other factors that are beyond the community's control. When I got to the city of Toledo, our strategy was really more comprehensive. And I think that shift was more because my role changed. I was in more of a city administrator role. And it was really about not only the three-pronged approach that I talked about in Dayton, but it was also about how do we get our community development department engaged? How do we address lighting in communities? How do we address vacant properties? How do we address code enforcement issues? When we started meeting with the community, both about community police relations and violence, it wasn't about the relationship with law enforcement oftentimes. Oftentimes, they wanted law enforcement to be there and to create a safer community. All of the issues that were coming up were really about infrastructure investments. It was about sidewalks. It was about lighting. It was about high grass where young people were hiding guns. It was about making sure that vacant properties were boarded up. So whatever intervention or solution or preventative strategies you implement, it really has to also include community development and how you're working with, supporting small businesses in those communities, providing opportunities for people to make money. When we were dealing with high grass issues, we actually employed micro businesses to do the grass cutting. So that provided opportunities for people to make money. So what is that comprehensive strategy, not only to address violence, but to address the economic conditions in those communities? And then when I was with the city of Dayton, when we initially implemented the SERVE initiative, we had our hospitals involved, the city was involved, private sector was also involved. Long term, that was not a sustainable strategy. It should be, but it was not always a sustainable strategy. And so the local government did a lot of that heavy lift, and then also getting money from federal government, foundation support, and things like that. I think that we need to make sure that that our businesses understand that violence does impact economic development. And so there needs to be a commitment from our private sector partners as well to help with these solutions. And then we did use ARPA dollars in Toledo, as well as our entitlement funding, so CDBG dollars, to support some of our nonprofits, doing capacity building with our nonprofits, to the point that Mayor Johnson made. Some of our nonprofits that have the greatest amount of trust in our communities are the ones that need the greatest capacity investment, because they are working with our most marginalized communities. And so building out a capacity building program to help strengthen those nonprofit organizations so that they're able to get the resources they need to continue supporting the communities that they serve was a part of that strategy as well.
Thank you, Katie, for fitting so much important information into such a short time frame. What I'm taking away from what you're saying really reinforces what the mayor said earlier, which is that public safety is a public responsibility, and that means you need engagement from the private sector, from philanthropy. I hear that you were pulling dollars from ARPA and from the federal government, as well as local dollars, in order to support all of this work. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear to our audience, because I think a lot of communities are trying to figure out, how do we kind of piece this all together? And then to your point, how do we make it clear that everyone needs to be invested in this work? This is not just a problem of a specific neighborhood, a specific community. It really is the entire, city locality that has to be invested in this work. So I am mindful that we are over time, but what I wanted to do was just give each of our panelists a moment to close, share any final thoughts. If you want to speak to the questions around sustainability and funding, please feel free. But anything else that you want to close with, that you want our participants to take away from the experience you've had working on community safety, is much appreciated. So I will start with Mayor Johnson, being mindful that he may have other things he needs to run off to do.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all, and certainly to share, and shouts out to our friends at Cities United that help us do this work. So we start off at about $450,000, $459,000. We're up to about $1.8 million. It comes from our general fund. To us, this is just as important as guns and police cars and police uniforms as well. People don't feel invested unless they're investing. And so as the will of this administration and this government, we're going to invest in prevention as much as we do in terms of enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for making us Brooklynites proud. And Savannah, appreciate all of the great work that you're doing. And please come visit us at John Jay, and hopefully you can forgive us for our past mistakes.
No.
But it's a pleasure to be here with you. So thank you very much. I'm gonna kick it over to Patrice.
Yes, thank you for that. At the Center for Community Transitions, we have a vision for a desistance from crime-enabled community, and that's long game work. Desistance being defined as the process by which people who have criminal offending histories cease from criminal activity. And with the right supports, both from housing to employment to substance use recovery, to education, financial literacy, and more recently, small business development, what are the ways comprehensively that we can provide that support? And for us at the Center for Community Transitions, and truly for the ecosystem of reentry partners in Mecklenburg County, which now includes government, which I'm happy to say publicly, since 2018 specifically, that centering lived experience. We have Cure Violence here, and they have a great relationship with our local Urban League that has been doing violence disruption work in partnership with the grassroots organizations. And as we say, people from around the way that have been doing that work that Mayor Johnson described, coaches and folks in the neighborhood, the folks who are at the corner store. This is the way that we've been able to operationalize this work in Mecklenburg County. And I'll leave with the Criminal Justice Services in Mecklenburg County established the Community Engagement Task Committee in 2021. And right now, as we speak, we have a subcommittee on the Community Engagement Task Group that is looking to assess and understand the relationship between law enforcement and the community to develop actionable strategies that will tree up to our criminal justice advisory group, which is made up of system actors that include the public defender, the district attorney, the clerk of court, director of criminal justice services, those that have decision authority to move strategies forward. And again, centering the lived experience and operationalizing much of the work that has already been happening in communities. And ultimately, as we've all said, funding it appropriately.
Thank you, Patrice. Sheyla has agreed to give up her time because we are over time. So thank you for that, Sheyla. I want to thank our attendees for joining us and for staying a little bit past the hour. I hope what everyone who watches this can take away is that there is incredible work happening around the country to really invest in communities, and it is having important impacts on people's lives and on safety. And that regardless of the outcomes of our elections, nationally, statewide, local, there are always organizations and people that are doing this important work, and there are opportunities for government to support that work. And our goal at the Future Public Safety Initiative is to continue to lift up that important work that's happening and provide as much support as we can for it. So thank you so much to each of our panelists for joining us today, but most importantly for the work that you do each and every day in your communities. We see it and we appreciate it. So thank you all very much on behalf of President Mason and our partner organizations. Thank you for this rich conversation. Thanks to the attendees for joining. I just want to make a couple announcements. One is that our final webinar of this workshop series is going to be held on November 20th at 1 p.m. And we're going to be focusing on the role of racial reconciliation and healing in promoting public safety. Our featured speakers will include Mayor Victoria Woodards of Tacoma, Washington, as well as remarks from the leaders of the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge partner organizations. We invite you to register for it. Rebecca, I believe, has put a link in the chat. If you've got any questions, our email is in the chat as well. So please reach out to us. And again, we thank you all for joining us today.